Brett McCurdy, though.
We're going to kill a little time with Coach, too, because he could get disrupted a little bit before you get started in your talk.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we have till 8. I don't want you to
I'm
have
good.
to do the whole time.
No, I'm good. I'm good.
Okay, we're going to go. We have a few people still registering, but we're going to go ahead and start the evening. We're going to kill a little bit of time with some brief stories. A little introduction with Coach Squires, and then I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker. So if you'd share a little bit about Brett. I'm going to let Coach Squires talk a little bit about Brett and his experience with Dr. Haskell.
Dr. Haskell, first of all, let me just thank Dr. Haskell once again in front of all of you for being here. You know, she is extremely accomplished, and we're very fortunate to have her on campus. So to anyone who made that happen, thank you. And I think this is going to be, you know, really informative. And she was kind enough to spend a little bit of time with our team earlier this afternoon, and it was just awesome. So I think we're in for something really great. If you're not aware, Dr. Haskell played volleyball here. She was here for 5 years. She redshirted a year, came in as a walk-on, and quite honestly, I probably had one of those meetings with her in the first couple of years where I probably told her something like, I'm not sure you can hang at this level, and you know, I probably wasn't very encouraging. And she didn't listen to me. She was smarter than that. She stuck it out. She became a 3-year starter and played on some of the best teams that we've ever had. Her last 2 years here, when she was a junior and senior, we only lost 3 matches. I don't remember the winning number. I mentioned it earlier. It was like 78 or something like that. So we were like 78-3 her last 2 years. She played in the national title game, went to a Final Four, and was a big part of a whole lot of success. And I also got to admit, I was probably a little rough on you at times.
Oh, yeah.
And maybe more so than others, and I don't know why. Maybe I figured she could handle it, and I was a little more fiery back in those days. And when I walked into the classroom today, she asked me if I was a little nervous to see her here and wondered what she was going to say, and I said, yeah, a little bit. And so I'm trying to butter her up a little bit. So
Psychologists love making people uncomfortable.
She goes easy on me, but what she's done at the University of Nebraska and in her career, we're so proud of. We're so proud to be associated with it as an athletic department and a program. And we brag about her all the time. She doesn't know that, but every time somebody comes in who's a recruit and we start talking about our sports psych experience with Dr. Fritzen, we mention Dr. Haskell, and so we're big believers in this, and I think that this kind of thing is just going to get bigger and bigger. So welcome back, and we appreciate you being here, and you know, we're proud to call you a Loper.
Thank you.
Again, appreciate you being here. Dr. Haskell, it was her last year as an undergrad, the year I started at UNK, and so I really didn't get to develop a relationship or a teaching relationship with her, but she has been very kind. This is her second time back on campus, just in my time here at least. I think third time, actually, second time to be a speaker for our program, our end of the year banquet tomorrow evening, and our Psych-I induction for our psychology honor students. So we really appreciate it. I'm going to set the stage for her to talk about her journey a little bit before she talks about her talk. And I really want you to hear what it takes to become a clinical psychologist, what it takes to become a sports psychologist, because this takes a lot of training, it takes a lot of energy, and she's not only used it to benefit many young people, but she continues to give back. And that's the epitome of a Loper, right? And so I really want to say that to you all. She's an alumnus, she's a quality act, and we appreciate you so much. And please don't be too humble as you share a little bit about yourself and your journey. Okay? All right. Dr. Brett Haskell. McCurdy was her maiden name, so if you want to look up anything online.
I don't know if there's anything that you'll want to read about my McCurdy name, but okay, how do I turn this on? Technology is not my forte. I tell people that if it doesn't have to do with your heart or your mind, I don't really care about it. I'm not interested.
You're already on.
Okay, perfect. You can hear me in the back? Awesome. I don't like talking about myself. I'd much rather talk about athletes in the brain. But Dr. Fritzen asked me to talk a little bit about kind of my journey, and I know that people have a lot of interest in sports psychology as a field. I get probably, I probably get 15 emails a week, and if any of them are from you and I have not responded, feel free to email me again. It's okay. But at 15 years ago, when I graduated from UNK in 2005, so we're looking at 18 years ago now, the field of sports psychology didn't really exist, to be honest. I watched a video in one of my classes, and there was a guy named Bruce Ogilvie, and he was actually a kinesiologist who was doing some sports psych work with the Olympics, the Canadian Olympics, I think, at the time. I think there were about 4 psychologists working in collegiate sport in 2005. And so I didn't know anything about this field. I was very, very naive. And I had some mentors here who supported my dual interest in sport and the brain. And they were like, you know what, Brett, you can figure this out. You can do this. So I started exploring. I applied to a bunch of random programs that called themselves sports psychology programs. Little did I know at the time there were a lot of different routes to getting into sports psychology, some of which were on the sports science side, some of which were on the clinical side. I applied to a few different programs and actually ended up in a kinesiology or sports science program. I didn't know at the time that if you go that route, you actually cannot work in an applied way with athletes. So I was gonna have to be a researcher and an academic, and figured out pretty quick in that program that was not what I wanted. I wanted to work with people. So they pushed me to then apply to a clinical psych program. So I was 3 years into a graduate training at that point, and a clinical program was 5 more years. So my stubbornness that Coach talked about, and my persistence maybe, just made me kind of say, okay, well, this is what I want to do, so I'm going to take this track. At that time, that was 2008-ish. I think that the field had grown to about, there were 3 psychologists working with the USOPC at the time, and there were probably 7 in collegiate sport. So fortunately, my husband didn't look at the job prospects because there weren't any. And I went to a clinical program, and I went to the University of Kansas, which had one of those few psychologists at the time who was embedded in sport. KU had been kind of at the forefront and hired an embedded sports psychologist who had dual training. And she took me on as a mentee, and I got to work in Kansas athletics doing sports psychology with their student athletes for the entire 4 years that I was in my clinical training there, which really put me in a unique position as the field kind of exploded around 2013, 2014, and pretty much every division. And there was some NCAA legislation that came out around that time that essentially said all Division I, in fact, I think it might be even Division II now, schools had to have an affiliation with a mental health provider. And it was really focused on mental health. But of course, these are competitive entities, so they wanted to find people who could do both the mental health and help with high performance and raising and elevating performance through the mental side of the game. And so these athletic departments just started hiring lots and lots of people who were trained like me, and there weren't that many because, again, the field didn't exist in the 10 years prior to that. So I was in a really, really fortunate position, and I'll be frank, like, they're being very kind to me, but I think a lot of what happened, I'm gonna talk about this tomorrow to the psychology program, is there's a theory in career psychology called planned happenstance, which is that you kind of end up in the right place at the right time, and you're curious and persistent, and you work hard, and good things kind of happen. And I would say most of my career is a result of that, rather than anything that makes me really special. I kind of got into the right thing at the right time, and it exploded. So in 2014, Nebraska, I actually met a psychiatrist who was doing some part-time work, kind of like Dr. Fritzen with Nebraska at the time, at a conference. And I had been hired back on at Kansas after I finished my grad degree, and he wanted to, essentially, they wanted to hire a full-time psychologist at Nebraska. And so he started kind of talking to me. He invited me to come to campus, and they ended up creating a full-time position, and I was hired into that role in 2014. I was the only sports psychologist embedded at Nebraska until 2014. In 2016, we hired a second psychologist, and next year we'll have 7 behavioral health providers on our staff. Some of those will be, we have 1 graduate trainee, we're gonna have a postgraduate fellow, We'll have 3 full-time psychologists, 1 licensed independent mental health practitioner who is also dual trained in sports psych. All of our clinicians are dual trained, meaning that they both have that sports science, mental toughness training background, and they have clinical training as well. So we're going to talk tonight about how that intersects and what that really means, because I think sports psych gets kind of squishy to people and confusing, and it is both how we take care of the brain from a wellness standpoint and how we train the brain to be a high-performing instrument for elite performers in sport, in music, in theater, sometimes in our jobs, in the coaching field. So the great thing about sports psychology is that it really applies to anybody who's trying to do something at a very high level. And we're going to talk about that whole continuum of care tonight. At Nebraska, this is embedded into everything that we do. We're part of a 5-spoke wheel of performance at Nebraska. So all of strength and conditioning, nutrition, sports psychology, athletic medicine, and our sports scientists, we all fall under performance, and we work together in teams to collaborate and integrate the way that we approach developing our student athletes, because the reality is that those things all intersect, and we'll talk about that tonight too, because how you fuel your body affects your brain. And how you take care of your body and how you manage load and strain affects your brain. So these are things that have to be built together and woven together to really help people be elite performers. And mental health is an important part of that, just like physical health is. So sometimes our athletes get sick physically, they get a virus, they get the flu, sometimes it's more serious, sometimes they get injured, right? And sometimes they struggle with mental illness. And we have to address all of those things within the context of them being a high performer. So that's a little bit about so now I'm the director of sports psychology at Nebraska. I've been the director since 2018. I also do some consulting work on the side. I do a lot of assessment work in my consulting business. Recently I was at the NFL Combine doing testing with NFL Combine athletes and consulting with some of the NFL teams about their draft selections. So those are some of the things that I do on a consulting basis when I'm not spending my time with the Husker athletes. So, all right, let's jump into it. It's all in your mind. What a great title, right? It actually is. It's all up here. It's all in your brain. So I tell my athletes and I tell recruits, I meet with a lot of recruits when they come to Nebraska, is that we talk about being mentally tough, or you got to have the right mindset, or they're a head case, right? We hear these things talked about all the time. But I like to tell my athletes, if I cut your skull right here and I pulled your skull back, that's kind of gross. But if I did that, guess what I would find up there? An organ. Shocking, I know, because this mental thing that we talk about is an actual organ. And we spend a lot of time with athletes and high performers talking about all the other organs in their body, right? We talk about their muscles, we talk about their bones, we talk about their heart, we talk about how we can improve their cardiovascular system. We talk about all those things, and we train those things, and we dial into those things, and we, every day in our environment, we are focusing on how do we optimize those things. But all those things run at the discretion of this organ right here. All of those things run at the discretion of this organ right here. And if you really want to optimize those things, you also have to optimize your brain. And you have to be taking care of your brain health. So I like to think of mental health more as brain health, because when you're taking care of your central nervous system, your peripheral nervous system works better, all your organs work better, your motor functioning and motor skill acquisition and skill execution work better. You have to have a high functioning brain if you want to be a high functioning performer, and there's actually a lot of very specific and targeted ways that you can both take care of your brain from a wellness standpoint and take care of your brain from a high performance standpoint. And those are some of the things we're going to talk about tonight. All right. So, the mind is ultimately the interaction of your brain with your body and your environment, all of which are very, very important, all of which can cause distress, and all of which can positively impact and nudge your brain in the direction of health and high performance, okay? So, when we think about this interactive effect, we have to address that whole system. We have to make sure that the brain is in optimal state to function at a high level. we have to make sure that the body is being well taken care of, and we have to make sure that we have a healthy environment. Does anybody want to take a crack at guessing what the brain is for? None of the psychologists can guess. What do you think your brain is for? Some brave soul. We talked about risk with the volleyball team. Anybody want to throw something out? What's your brain for?
To keep you alive.
Well, just right away, right off the bat, steal my thunder. Your brain's job is to keep you alive, okay? It is a blob of fat inside your skull in a dark box. And the only way that your brain can make decisions to keep you alive is through sense data from your senses, right? Which is your nervous system and your body. Your body is signaling information to your brain at all moments as it scans your environment and makes sense of it so that your brain can make decisions to try in the favor of life and away from death. And this is how your brain operates all day long. So when we start to understand fundamentally what your brain is for, we can start to understand behavior a lot better, because much of your behavior is controlled by that decision between, is this going to help me live longer or is this going to kill me? And a lot of the way our brain makes those decisions are not actually that helpful. They are sort of evolutionary mechanisms and stuff that we did when we were cavemen and women that now, in our present day and age, when we're very, very safe, are no longer all that useful to us. But our brain still does them. And it does them because it thinks that if it doesn't do them, we will die. And a lot of what I do is teach people how to override those old systems so that they can get their bodies to do what seems like very difficult, challenging, scary things in these high performance environments. And this is a big part of how we think about approaching elite mental performance and wellness. All right, we talk a lot about developing and cultivating grit and resilience, okay? So grit and resilience are the ability to overcome adversity, to tolerate discomfort, to engage in risky situations so that we can accomplish difficult, hard things. And doing that for long periods of time, over time, and hopefully increasing our ability to do hard things for longer. The interesting thing about the resilience building process is that you're actually using the very same neurobiology when you build resilience. And when I talk about neurobiology, I'm talking about the way that brain, central nervous system, and peripheral nervous system interact with your body. And you use the same neurobiology to build resilience that causes you mental illness. Okay, I want to say that one more time. You use the same neurobiology, the same things are happening in your body and brain when you build resilience that happen in your body and brain when you develop mental illness. The difference is that the mental illness is often caused by the wrong balance of these things, and resilience is caused by the right balance of these things, okay? When we activate that stress system, stress gets a really bad rap. Oh, I'm so stressed. Stress is really bad. We got to stay away from stress. Stress is actually really good for building resilience and grit. The right amounts at the right times, and importantly, with a balance of recovery, similar to muscular development. So let's go back here for a second. So the stress system is your peripheral nervous system that we talked about. Central is brain and spinal cord. And your peripheral nervous system includes your skeletal muscle system. So if you're an athlete, it's the part of your nervous system that's making your muscles and your limbs move and do the things you want. And then the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system has a fight or flight response and a rest and digest response, okay? And when we experience a stressor, what happens is there's this smoke detector in our brain that we call the amygdala, and it goes off because it perceives some level of danger or risk, and our job is to keep us alive, right? And so it says, hey, this could kill us. And then it triggers 1,500 changes in our biology to help us mobilize and protect ourselves from that danger. That mobilization, though, is what we experience as excitement, as energy, as being ready for competition, as like I'm energized and I'm focused and I want to compete. It's that competitive mindset. That's that same neurobiology. And when we do that in a way that we're kind of pushing ourselves into discomfort, but we're balancing that with coping skills to deal with that discomfort, we actually overcome obstacles, we challenge ourselves, we overcome the adversity that we're facing, and we build resilience. We build that grit by trying hard things and having skills to help us cope with those difficult environments. We're mobilizing the same system. Now, if we are spread too thin, we're taking on too much of that stress, too much of the time, and we're not recovering well from that stress. So we want to periodize stress similar to how we periodize workouts. How many people are familiar with periodizing a workout? Hands? A little bit. Okay, so you periodize workouts, you want to strain your muscles, and then you want to recover your muscles because that's what builds strength, right? When you go in and you go into a weight room, you're tearing things apart, and when you sleep, they are healing, and when they heal stronger, okay? Same thing with the stress response in mental health and high performance mental states or resilience and grit is that we create conditions where we kind of stress ourselves out. Like I'm gonna really push the limits of what I'm capable of, but I'm also going to engage in really high levels of recovery, fueling myself well, sleeping well, engaging in healthy relationships, having breaks and enjoyable, pleasurable activities that are non-stressful, so that I can balance the strain and the load on my system with that recovery. And when we do that, that's when we start to facilitate growth in terms of our resilience and our grit. There's a lot on folks' plates nowadays. And I would argue it's funny, Coach Hammond is the assistant volleyball coach here, and we've been talking a lot about our experiences as collegiate athletes here and the difference between what collegiate athletes' experiences look like now. And I just think the biggest difference is the volume of responsibilities and the volume of opinions and the age at which all of that occurs for you all compared to us. And I think you're getting all that responsibility and pressure earlier, and the volume of things that are being demanded of you is very, very high, and the amount of time that you get to hear what other people think you should be doing on things like this is also very, very high. And so I think there's a tremendous amount of strain now on our culture, frankly. And I feel it too in different ways that I didn't maybe 20 years ago. And we have to balance that. That can be an okay thing if we're balancing that with that strain and recovery process. And that's a big part of how we take care of the brain. Okay. I think about, so let's boil sports psychology down. Let's get granular with it and try to think more clearly about what does that mean, because you're going to hear a lot of crap out there, if I'm being completely honest, about what sports psychology is. From a practical, pragmatic standpoint, people who are in the trenches doing the work, what it is this. It is a continuum of care for the brain, okay? Just like the body, the brain will at times experience mental illness. That's over here. Sometimes that mental illness is very severe, okay? Kind of like, more like a bout of cancer, right? Sometimes it's very severe, and that might be like chronic bipolar disorder, or psychosis, or addiction, things of that nature. Sometimes it's very, very severe. And when that's the case, it's kind of like having diabetes. You might have to take insulin your whole life, right? You might have to work on your mental health your whole life. That just might be part of your life if you have severe and persistent mental illness. That's okay. You can live a very healthy, happy life. You just have to focus more on that recovery piece and being very deliberate and intentional about your wellness, about how you take care of your brain. You have to be very deliberate about your sleep and your fueling for your body, about going to your therapy, about working on your skills that you're being given. And then sometimes mental health is more kind of in the middle of the continuum, okay? And I'm trying to think, to your left, if we're to your left in the middle, that might be like an episode of depression or anxiety, right? And sometimes things just build up to a point that they just start to spill over, right? And when that happens, we start to experience something we call functional impairment. Functional impairment means I can't concentrate as well as I used to be able to concentrate. I don't find joy and pleasure in as many things as I used to find joy and pleasure. I'm more irritable, and I'm snapping at people in ways that I didn't used to snap at people. In sport, it actually can impair your motor functioning. So we actually see impairment in what's called your working memory, which means you can't process things as quickly, you can't learn as fast as you're used to learning. It's harder to make your body do the things that you want it to do. Your energy systems are depleted, so you run out of gas quicker than other people. And for our student athletes, that happens. For all people, that happens. Actually, 1 in 4 adults and adolescents will experience some version of that kind of mental illness. And I would compare that to like a bad flu, right? Like we get a bad flu, we go to the doctor, we take a week off of school or work, we sleep a lot, and then we get better, right? That type of mental illness is the same kind of thing. It affects you, and you need to take care of it, and you need to take care of it in a way that's supported by treatment and by what we know works for people. But you can get better, and within probably 6 to 8 weeks, most people are going to recover from that type of mental illness and be pretty okay and back to themselves, especially if they get treatment and they work on the strategies that will improve your mental health. So we see a lot of that in our college athlete population. I would say 1 in 4 is fairly typical. And that's what we see in the general population, and that's also what we see in athletes. Athletes' brains are the same as everybody else's, as are their bodies. They get the flu and they get mental illnesses. And that's just part of it. So we address that, we take care of them, and generally, just like the flu, they get better and they get back to being themselves and feeling better. And we're going to talk in a second about why that's so important to treat from a performance standpoint and not overlook. Just like we don't overlook somebody having the flu or having strep throat or things of that nature. Now, if we're getting over here, this is where a lot of our population, so at Nebraska, we, on average, every year, we see about 60% of our student athletes for individual work. That's not all on that end of the continuum, though. In fact, I would say about 30% of it is probably that end of the continuum, and the rest of it is over on this side of the continuum, which is more how do we, once we're healthy, once I'm doing okay, I'm a pretty healthy person, I like my life, things are pretty good. Now, how do I push the boundaries of what I can get my brain and my body to do? How do I become really exceptional in high-pressured situations? How do I persist longer than other people? How do I optimize my focus and attention so that I can stay dialed in, and when it's an elite competition, I know I can show up the way I need to? That's really what we're doing over here on this end of the continuum. And up here, these people are incredibly deliberate about their mental training. They are routined. They have rhythms. They wear bands to tell them exactly how they're taking care of their brain. We can measure. We use something called heart rate variability to measure that nervous system functioning that I was talking to you all about. And we assess, is that getting better? Is that getting worse? What do we need to do to optimize? How do we modulate your nervous system, both central and peripheral, to put you in the optimal zone, to be able to concentrate, to focus, to exert the right amounts of energy at the right times, to make the right decisions effortlessly. And we spend a lot of time trying to create training plans and to create execution plans for them, high performance plans, so that they are working day in and day out on putting themselves in that optimal zone for functioning. And I will say probably 80% of our elite competitors fall into, like, and when I say elite, I'm talking like all Big Ten, all conference, all Americans, right? That's these folks right here. About 80% of them, I would say, are this deliberate about their psychological skills training. And when you get to the next level, which is the folks that I'm testing at the Combine, we're actually looking for the people who probably have already done this, and we're assessing those behaviors, because what we're finding in the NFL, and we have 10 years of data now, is that we're finding those people in the NFL persist longer, they get picked up for second contracts, they're most likely to get snaps on the field, they're most likely to get back quickly after injury, the people who are up here. And so we're actually helping teams try to identify those people before they pay them millions and millions of dollars, so that they can be more successful. All right, so how does mental health affect performance? When we have a mental health condition, as we talked about before, even a mild mental health condition, we call that like a subclinical condition. You might not, like, we might call it the blues versus depression, right? Or I'm feeling really burnt out versus depression. And what happens is that is like subclinical mental health issues where well-being is being disrupted, okay? And what's happening is there's a lot of neurobiological changes occurring when our mental health is starting to decompensate and our neurobiology is starting to decompensate. And it has a really profound impact on our reaction times, on our skill acquisition, on the way that our brain talks to our body, the efficiency with which our brain talks to our body. Your brain is talking to your body through neurons in that nervous system. So when I tell my brain to lift my arm up or I tell it to move my mouth and say certain words, that's my central nervous system telling my body to do it. And when we're dealing with disruption to our brain, our central nervous system, and it might just be like my life is so stressful and I'm not sleeping very well, right? Or it might be, you know, I've got a lot going on back home and I can't focus very well. It changes the way the brain talks to the body, and it actually affects physical performance because the brain is the one in control. It's all in your mind. It's the one controlling everything. It's the organ controlling everything. So this is actually an example of an elite athlete. And I saw this athlete at baseline. And they were pretty healthy, high functioning, never had a mental health condition prior to coming. They were a freshman, and they experienced a lot of stress the first year. And when I saw them the first time, it was more for mental skills training, kind of like an introduction to mental skills training and working on some very specific skills in season. And when I saw them the second time, they actually had decompensated, and the stress of being a freshman, all of the responsibilities, all of the pressure, they weren't playing quite as well as they wanted to. They were having some difficulties in their social life. They weren't sleeping as well. School had gotten really hard, and they were dealing with some subclinical mental health issues. And what we saw was there was a direct correlation to actually her performance. And we actually see this quite a bit. And the unfortunate thing is then it becomes kind of a vicious cycle of I'm not performing well, I feel bad about myself, I'm really frustrated, I'm trying to force it and make it happen, and then I feel worse and my mental health suffers more. And so we take the approach of early aggressive intervention, because once an athlete starts to see performance declines, we actually see a really rapid decline in their mental health as well. So we have to get in there and we have to address sort of these subclinical issues, help them kind of address some of their wellness, free them up from some of that stress. We do things around cognitive approaches, so changing how they're thinking, changing their routine, incorporating some additional recovery techniques, things of that nature, to get them feeling better faster. So what you see over here is for a typical person, like me, I'm pretty normal, right? I don't need to like go out there and win a national championship. I'm not competing in the Big Ten right now. So my daily functioning can take a hit and I can still do my job okay, right? Most of us, that's the case. When you are performing at these very, very, very high levels and we are expecting eliteness out of you and you're already in like the top 10% of people for what you do, then your performance is all the way up there. And when we start to see small declines in that performance, suddenly your competition just leaps you, right? And that's when we start the psychology, the mindset, right? Confidence declines, belief in self declines. We start to have more negative thoughts. We start to have more negative affective states, which is feelings. And it accumulates quickly and it compounds quickly, and they can suddenly drop into pretty severe states of mental illness because of the compounding effect and the repeated experiences of failing in these very, very high exposure situations. So normal people, mental health might look more like this as it's getting worse. For elite performers, it can be a very striking decline very quickly. So if you look over here, this is how we do an outcome measure. So I'm big on measuring our outcomes and assessing whether or not we're actually seeing behavioral changes with the interventions that we do. This is an outcome measure of mental health that we used. And so the first dots, the low dots, are basically she was feeling pretty good in all of these areas in the first dot in each column. And then the second dot was when she came in the second time, where we're seeing that. And the yellow is more that subclinical not that super severe mental illness, but just kind of like, I just don't feel like myself. I'm kind of blue. I feel stressed out. Like things aren't what I'd like them to be. And the red would be clinical mental illness. And what we saw in the first one is she was doing okay, but in the second one, she was really starting to experience that stress. And if you look here, this is her some metrics for her performance. And at baseline, she had a really high hitting efficiency. She had a really high kill percentage, and this is based on practice, not competition. So we looked at her practice during the first period of time and practice during the second period. Her block efficiency was very high, and we saw a stark decline that didn't match her physical abilities. So I would say she was playing well at baseline, but not like exceptional. She was playing pretty consistent with what we'd expect for her. And then we saw this dramatic decline in her performance when her mental health started to suffer. And that's because the brain, again, cannot make the body do what the body needs to do at that level when the brain is suffering. And so this is another reason from a performance standpoint, I call it performance-based mental health, because for a normal person, they probably maybe would have sought counseling or psychotherapy for where she was at follow-up. But for an athlete, it's really, really essential and critical to intervene at that stage because things can compound so quickly, especially as their performances start to decline. So athletes with mental health issues. I mean, this is the really cool thing in my field, and I think it's part of why our field has grown so fast to the point where I actually have a hard time hiring people now because there are so many jobs out there for people in our field. So if you're interested in this field, it is a great time to get into it if you can persist through graduate school. So if you can do 8 years of graduate school, it's a great career. And there's lots of jobs. But these are some of the folks who come out publicly about their mental health. And again, across that same continuum. So we go all the way from Michael Phelps has had some very severe mental health issues. We call them co-occurring disorders because he's had both addiction and mental health issues. Depression, I believe, and anxiety and addiction. So that's pretty severe. PTSD, this was the issue with the Bills, and I'm actually really good friends with the Bills psychologist, and it was very interesting to talk to her about the effects of the cardiac arrest that their player had, the Damar Hamlin situation, and how that affected all of the players who I think a lot have dealt with trauma after that incident, all the way to depression, anxiety, just grief, perfectionism, chronic stress, fatigue, and then there's just the high performance training, right? Tom Brady is well known for all of the high performance mental training that he did. Jordan Larson talks very publicly about all of the mental training that she's done. There's a lot of these folks who have gone on since they've recovered from their mental illness to speak more publicly about the mental skills part of their training and their mental coaching. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit here. Here's the good news. People get sick and they also get better, and treatment works, okay? Treatment works. Now, treatment is very specific and targeted, and we have scientific studies to show what treatments tend to work the best. Cognitive interventions, changing the way we think about things, actually affects our physiology. So you can change your body. That's what we talked to volleyball earlier about. We can change our bodies by changing the way we talk to ourselves, by changing the way we focus on things, by changing our perception of our environment and working on our perception of our environment. We can actually alter our brains. Mindfulness-based work, if you don't have access to psychotherapy or that seems expensive or it's hard there's not a lot of it around here, starting with the Calm app or Headspace, those are two great apps out there that have a ton of really good information and applicable skill training that can help with mental health. The Big Ten actually pays for the Calm app for all Big Ten athletes, so that's something we're really proud. We found out last week that we have the most athletes registered in the Big Ten for the Calm app, and our athletes use it a ton. It's a meditation-based app, but they do a lot of skill building in it, and there's like LeBron's on there, and he has 2 training sessions that are like each 8 sessions where he just talks about how he uses mental skills. If you don't have access to a sports psychologist, that's a great starting place. Like, go listen to what he's doing and then use some of the tools on the Calm app. But treatment works. Other interventions are neurobiological, so social rhythms, working on your sleep routine. The number one thing I could do for anyone's mental health is teach them better sleep habits. If you are not sleeping well and you feel like crap, and things aren't going the way you want them to, try your sleep first. Work on your sleep first. Try to get 8 hours, try to go to bed at a certain time and wake up at a certain time. Really get consistent with that. Our brains are our brain health is based on our metabolism and how our metabolism works, and that's all based on rhythms, circadian rhythms that are uniquely respondent to waking and sleeping. Waking and sleeping. And we feel energy at particular times of day when we hopefully should, so that we're more focused at work. And we actually, for your physiology, if you have afternoon practices, we know that there's some optimal things around physiology when we have good, healthy sleep that are regulated in the afternoon, higher, they peak in the afternoon. So when you can regulate your body's rhythms, you can do a lot for your brain health. The other piece is fuel. The brain is uniquely responsive to how you fuel your body because brain fuel is glucose. And you have to have glucose in your system in order for your brain to work well. So I made Coach Hammond take me to dinner at 5 o'clock because I knew by 8 o'clock I have kids, so we eat very regimented at like 5:30 to 6 every night. And I knew by 8 p.m. my brain would be powering down. My working memory and my ability to talk to you all and sound remotely smart would be very poor if I didn't eat because my brain needs glucose in order for it to function. So those are two really simple things. If you want to increase your brain health and your wellness and your brain for high performance, sleeping and how you fuel your body and how you hydrate are really simple starting places. But treatment does work. Working with counselors works. They know all these techniques. They know all of this about the brain, and their job is to help you learn these things so that you can implement strategies in your day-to-day life. Here's the deal though, it takes effort. You're not gonna be a high brain performer. You're not gonna be mentally tough because you come to this talk. Sorry, I'm not that good. If I was, I wouldn't be here. I'd be making a lot more money. I'd be on a beach somewhere. You have to put effort into it just like physical training. And effort means daily work. And you don't have to work at all of it every day, but you have to work at something every day if you want to improve your brain's ability to perform at a high level and to be healthier. It takes effort. And there is no way around that. There is no pill, there is no simple strategy. And as you look here at what works, so over in the top, the bright green, that's what works the best. Exercise works the best. If you're not regularly exercising and you're sleeping like crap, I just gave you 2 things that within 4 weeks will make you feel tremendously better. And then down here are the things that we know work, but they don't work as well as the things up there. So that's the pills. Pills work to a certain degree, and they work better for some people than for others, and they work better for certain diagnoses than for others. But the things that work the best are the behavioral interventions, and the basic wellness strategies, frankly, are what work the best. And then the talk therapy is really focusing on cognition, perception, mindfulness training, coping skills for adversity, so that we don't get that stress response all the time, all day, more than our brains can really handle. All right, why does this matter for sport? I kind of have hit on this already, but essentially, the brain controls the body. It's really not that complex. I don't think we think about it that way all the time, but when we talk about muscle memory, we're actually talking about the brain. It has nothing to do with your muscles. It is neural pathways to certain muscles in your body and bones in your body that cause your body to do certain things. It is all your neurobiology. It is all your nervous system. And when your central nervous system or your brain is not healthy, there is a complete breakdown in that system and you cannot execute. So motor coordination is really brain-body communication. And not only, so once you're healthy, what we're trying to do is make it talk faster. That's what I work with my athletes on a lot, is how do I make your brain talk faster to your body so that you're more explosive, you are more in the zone when you're out there competing in high-pressured situations. We talk about trusting our training a lot at Nebraska, and I want them to be able to fall back on their training and play effortlessly, which means that their brain is talking so fast they don't even have to think about it to their bodies. But that actually takes a lot of work to get to that place, and that's the work that we're doing. So efficient communication requires a healthy body and an optimal brain. Brain health is the foundation for elite performance. This is our framework for teaching mental skills at Nebraska. This is what all of our coaches get. This is what all of our athletes get. We think of brain performance and mental skill training in a hierarchical fashion, meaning that you can't skip steps and you have to have certain foundational pieces before you can get to other stages in elite mental performance. The first is what we've spent the last 40 minutes talking about. That's wellness and preparation, okay? Sleep, hydration, nutrition is number one. I bet that's not what you thought we were going to talk about today, but that is number one. Habits and discipline are number two. When we go look at NFL combine athletes, that's the number one thing we're trying to identify. Can they do that? Because if they cannot do that, they will not get picked up for a second contract, period, and they will fail miserably. And somebody else will work harder and be more disciplined, and they're all really freaking good. So the harder working athlete with better habits is going to last longer. Goal setting, tracking progress. Relationships. We are communal creatures. We do not exist without relationships. Those of us that do are psychopaths. I hope there's not any of those in here. Everybody needs people, and your people are important to your well-being. Don't neglect that. Identity outside of work. This is something that a lot of our athletes at Nebraska have to work on when they first get there, is that their identity has been wrapped up entirely in them as an athlete, and they don't have much of an identity outside of that. And then when they get into this environment where they are now a small fish in a big pond, when up to that point in their life they've always been the biggest fish in the smallest pond, all of a sudden their identity is very fractured and they feel like a shell of themselves because they're not starting, they're not getting all the praise, they're getting criticized for the first time in their life, they're being told that they're not as good, they're seeing that they're not as good as they always thought that they were. They're still really, really freaking good. It's just everybody around them is too. And so we have to work on helping them cultivate an identity that isn't entirely wrapped up in them as an athlete. And that makes it easier to then go do hard things and take that feedback every day and go get your butt whooped your whole freshman year so that you can get to your sophomore year and be better, right? But you have to have sources of healthy identity outside of sport. Next we get to composure, and we're gonna break these three down here in the next 15 minutes. Energy management and composure is really how do we regulate the nervous system. Your autonomic nervous system, which is that fight or flight and that rest and digest, it actually can hijack your brain and make it almost impossible for your brain to do what you want it to do, but it also can optimize physical functioning and brain functioning if you know how to kind of control it. So we talk about, this is a really fancy word, neuromodulation. But essentially what we're doing is we're trying to manipulate your nervous system into this optimal zone for you to have all these really positive performance benefits when we see performance shoot through the roof. And so we work with our athletes, and the other piece of this is that when that isn't well regulated, we actually see that's when people choke. That's what choking is when we can't regulate our nervous system and our brain basically goes haywire and the danger zone, the danger signals are screaming at us and everything starts to shut down, and that's when we choke. And the next piece is attention control, which is how do I pay attention to the right information and how do I push out distractions and control my attention, maintain mental flexibility so that I can move from a broad focus to a narrow focus, move from moment to moment, stay in the present moment. And then the last one is thought management. The funny thing is a lot of people think sports psych is just the top one. And that's actually the very last piece. We call that top-down strategies. Top-down are how I think about thinking, right? But unfortunately, if you are not regulating, if you can't self-regulate in these bottom three, you can't even control your thinking. So it's pointless to start there. I need you to be able to regulate your body before I can get you to regulate your thinking. All right, so this is what I am boiling. Is anybody else hot? Okay, it's not just me. I was like, am I not regulating my nervous system well? Body temperature is a sign.
It's not affecting your performance.
It's not affecting my performance? That's good to know. I'm like, I gotta take this off though, because I might pass out. Okay, so composure, this is what we just talked about. That's that second rung, right? We talked about wellness, now we're on to composure. Composure is your autonomic nervous system, which controls your peripheral nervous system, which controls your sympathetic nervous system and your parasympathetic. All that means is fight or flight and rest and digest, okay? And I told you earlier, our brains are predictive machines trying to keep us alive at all times and looking for danger, right? And so what happens is, in every situation, including this one, we're scanning, we're looking for danger. When our brain alerts to something that's high risk, right, which high performance environments typically are fairly high risk to us because we risk embarrassment, we risk failure, we risk rejection, right? And our brain really hates those things. So it's like danger, danger, right? And we get a dump of adrenaline into our system, or norepinephrine, and that actually can be really facilitative to high performance states to a certain degree, because it can increase our focus for a little bit, because it helps us like look for, oh, there's a tiger and I need to run, right? I need to be able to see the tiger, and then I need to look for my exit path, right? So it helps us focus for a little bit. So we get up here and we see higher performance when we get that increased activation of the fight or flight system to a certain point. The problem is, if we keep feeling like we're in danger, and we keep feeling like the threats are coming because I made a mistake and now my coach is gonna scream at me and my parents are gonna be disappointed and then I'm gonna get blown up on social media, and we keep feeling this intense fear, right? And our nervous system can't self-regulate and calm itself down, then all of a sudden we see performance start to radically drop really suddenly because we cannot modulate that system. So remember early on I talked about the same neurobiology that causes illness also causes resilience, building resilience. Same thing here for high performance. The same neurobiology, but varying levels of activation can cause really elite performance and can cause really horrific performance, okay? And so we want to find, we call this your individual zone of optimal functioning, and it's different for every individual, and it's different for every activity. But we want to find this optimal zone where I feel alert, I feel excited, I feel focused and zoned in, I feel like my brain is really sharp, right? My body is really sharp, I feel quick and explosive, but I don't feel tight, I don't feel tired, I don't feel worked up, I don't feel like my brain is all over the place and scattered, my vision isn't like really erratic. And the best way, the single best way, this is really easy actually. If you learn one thing today, this is besides sleep. This is they actually call me the sleep lady in the athletic department sometimes. But the best way to control this is your breath. And we're going to practice that. I'm going to teach you a breath skill in a little bit here. But your breath is the way you hack your autonomic nervous system. It is an automatic way to bring your nervous system under your control. So you can consciously control those 1,500 changes that happen when your brain screams, risk, danger. You can consciously control it with your breath. When we breathe in, it's activating the fight or flight system. And when we exhale, it's activating the rest and digest system. So if I need to get more activated, I do some vigorous exercise and I get myself inhaling a lot of oxygen. And I'm gonna get a burst of adrenaline, and I'm gonna activate. Because some of my athletes actually they're kind of like too chill. Like, hey, like I'm like, all right, let's wake up. And so we do burpees before a game, or they listen to loud music, or they will do some fast inhaling, and they do some different things. Some of my athletes, they are very tweaky, and it's like we're great, it's gonna be great, it'll be fine. And we are doing a lot of long, slow exhaling. And for some of them, I have one athlete right now who's a very elite performer, but has such a tweaky nervous system. She actually has to do 30 minutes of meditation prior to every practice and competition. And then she's great, and she can control it. But if she doesn't do that, there's a lot of like haywire stuff happening. This is breath control. If you ever watch the Nebraska volleyball team, watch them serve, they're actually trained to take a long, slow exhale right before they serve. Typically serving is a very stressful, because you're kind of on a stage by yourself. It's a very isolating experience. So people tend to go very high on this curve when they go back to serve by themselves, because it's a team sport. And so when they go back, part of their training is to learn to use their exhale as part of their serve routine. So they have a routine that calms their brain down. It's that predictive machine, right? So it's training their brain that in these moments, this is exactly what I do it all the time, I do it the same way every time, the brain predicts like the ball's gonna go exactly where I want it to go. And so they do the same routine, but part of that routine is a short inhale and a longer big exhale, so that they can just modulate that nervous system down a little bit, because we know almost always when they go back to serve, just like free throws, almost always when you go to take a free throw, you're gonna neuromodulate up a little bit, which takes you out of your optimal performance zone. So we wanna bring them back down right before those really critical moments. This is your nervous system and what's happening in your brain in those moments. So it's really interesting when people, how many people have heard of being in the zone or flow states? Okay, so there's really cool scientific research right now looking at being in the zone or being in flow states, and we see very specific anatomical changes occurring in the activation of the brain and the nervous system when people get into those states. And one of the changes that we see is actually there's something called hypofrontality, which means that the prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of the brain, or the part you typically think of as the thinking part of the brain, it actually starts to shut down. So if anybody's ever been in a flow state, you might have felt like time is either going really fast or it slows way down. It's kind of like that Matrix freeze frame effect. So a lot of people have it in video games. Apparently video games are great at hacking the brain. They have psychologists that they hire to make it addictive. But you'll get that freeze frame effect and it slows everything way down. And the reason is because time is calculated in the prefrontal cortex, and that part of the brain is actually winking out when we're in the zone. So limiting and reducing self-talk and even like thinking about what we're doing while we're in high performance actually can elevate performance. So a lot of what I train my athletes to do is to use their breath to find a focal point for their mind, so that it quiets the mind down and it's not spinning so much. Because we know that the neurobiology of what will happen when they can focus really simply on something like their breath is that it actually elevates and puts you in the right conditions to be in the zone. Attention control. So that actually goes right into attention control. Attention is a skill that you can build similar to the way that you build muscles. Attention is the ability of the brain to focus and concentrate, to sustain focus and concentration, and to drive out distraction when you want it to, okay? Attention is the worst it's ever been. We are actually testing people that attention, there was theories of attention, and we're actually seeing that what we used to think the capacity of people's attention systems has actually been significantly reduced, mostly because of this, including my own. Those of you who are my age, you might find it harder to sit down and read a book than we used to. A lot of that has to do with the depreciation in our attention systems. But you actually can train attention simply by doing more what we call monotasking. So I actually did a whole presentation for the football team last week on managing your mind and learning to monotask more so that we can actually strengthen our attention system. So we talk a lot about multitasking. How many people have heard of multitasking? Okay. When we multitask, we're not actually doing multiple things at once. We're actually rapidly shifting our attention from one thing to the other. Does that sound very effective? Good, because it's not. It is not effective at all. And if we actually just monotasked and we focused our brain on one thing at a time, and what I do with them is I teach them something called a Pomodoro technique, where they put their phones away for chunks of time and they have a timer set so that they can't have it. And they just focus on one task at a time. We actually work on building the attention system so we can sustain attention longer, our attention becomes more efficient, and we can move our attention when we want to more effectively. And we're not kind of teaching our brain to constantly do this, which is not very effective for sport. So attention is a really important piece of what we do. I would say it's a high level mental skill. The breathing is pretty low level, sleep is pretty low level, attention control is a little higher level. If this is an area of interest, I think the best thing you can do is probably working on meditation training, because meditation is basically teaching you to recognize when your brain is drifting and to bring it back to a simple focal point. And that's just something that we're finding is much more difficult for our brains to do in today's civilization. Thought management. So this is that very high level, right? This is self-talk. So our brain is built to judge, evaluate, and analyze so that it can, again, survive, right? Because survival is important. Living is important. We like living, yes. Worry is very adaptive. It was very adaptive when we were cavemen and women. We needed to worry a lot because there was a lot of danger. And we needed to constantly be what we call vigilant, which means scanning for all the danger, and then perceiving the danger, judging and evaluating, and then projecting that onto how I'm going to stay alive. Unfortunately, that's not the civilization. Well, fortunately, that's not the civilization we live in now. But unfortunately, our brain still operates that way. So the things we perceive as danger now are embarrassment, failure, disappointment, right? And our brain mobilizes that stress response to those thoughts about my mortgage, my marriage, my children, my job, whether or not I'm going to get the grade that I want, whether or not I'm going to get on the team that I want, whether or not I'm going to start. And our brain is treating all those situations like they might kill us. And so by working on our thought management and changing the way that we perceive our environment, talking to ourselves, not listening to ourselves, okay? When we listen to ourselves, we're just letting all that worry happen. When we talk to ourselves, we come back to reality and we anchor our brain down in the facts about our situation. Most of us are very, very safe, and most of us are in pretty good situations, and most of the time we're going to be okay. But we have to kind of bring our brain back down to that, and then we have to remind our brain why we're doing the hard things, why we're putting it in the challenging situations, because that aligns with our core values and what's important to us. And when we face adversity and challenge, because it's important to us, that actually helps us build resilience. And when we can talk ourselves into that and we can encourage ourselves, I tell my athletes, learn to be your own good coach, right? All of us had a good coach at some point who was really encouraging and who made us believe in ourselves. And if you can learn to do that within your own head, you can actually start to mobilize your own neurobiology and change the way that your brain talks to your body to get yourself to do harder things for longer. And then you conquer more stuff, and then you build confidence, and lots of good things happen. The brain is a manipulative storyteller. I told the volleyball team this earlier. You have about 60,000 thoughts in a day. Approximately 80% of those are negative thoughts. And that's because of our neurobiology and how it's been built over evolution. But you can control that by talking to yourself and working on that. Okay, so what can we do? This is mindfulness training. We do a ton of mindfulness training at Nebraska. That's the Calm app, the Headspace app that I told you about. Mindfulness is essentially just recognizing where your attention and focus is, and then having a focal point that you regularly bring it back to. A lot of times we use the breath because then we're engaging the composure system along with the focus system, okay? So we use the breath as the anchor. The other thing about the breath is that it's always with you, I tell my athletes, so you always have your skill with you when you use your breath as your anchor to the present. Because our minds are built for that predictive modeling, right? They're always trying to predict what's gonna happen. We spend lots of time reviewing the past in our minds, right? Thinking about what has happened, what I did in the past, how I failed, how I screwed up, how my life would have been better if this wouldn't have happened. And then we project that onto our future and what's gonna happen if that same stuff happens again in the future and how my life is gonna be affected. And our mind, if you think about it, spends tremendous amounts of time in that time machine, going backward and jumping forward, going backward and jumping forward. And my athletes do it actually in the midst of competition a lot of the time. They're doing it 4 or 5 seconds ago on the last play, they're in their heads about, and then they're projecting that on to 10 minutes from now when we're in the fourth quarter and we're in the red zone. Oh crap, right? And they're not just right here, right now. And what can you control? Right here, right now. You can control this moment right now. So we focus a lot on recognizing when their mind is drifting in the time machine and bringing their mind back to right here, right now. And sometimes that's just by anchoring on the breath. And that brings them back to the present. And it's their anchor so that they can stay right here, right now. We also know that athletes who get into those flow states, it's because they are deeply present. They are in the moment. They don't know what happened. And if you ask athletes after they've had a ridiculous performance and you're like, oh my gosh, do you remember this? They'll be like, no, I don't remember that. Because they were so deeply in the present that their brain wasn't even processing what has already happened or what will happen. All right. We're going to do a little exercise now. We're out of the boring me talking part. Okay. I am going to have you guys, so you're going to take your heart rate, and if you have a phone or a piece of paper, you're going to write it down afterwards, but I'll keep the timer for you. And what I want you to do is you're going to put your fingers on your wrist, find your heartbeat, and give everybody a second. Mine's going a lot faster than normal. Everybody found their heartbeat? And when I tell you to start, you're going to start counting, and when I tell you to stop, you're going to stop counting, okay? Ready? Go. And stop. Okay, now I want you to multiply that number by 4. I know, hard math. I'm testing your resilience right now. Most of you have stuck with me pretty long, so you're gritty at least. All right, multiply it by 4 and write it down. That's your resting heart rate, okay? Heart rate is a great way to measure your stress response. It's a really simple method. We use a lot of fancy stuff at Nebraska. You don't actually need fancy stuff. This is what psychotherapists were doing 30 years ago, and it was effective. All right. Now I want you to think of a stressful situation for you, a personally stressful situation, unique to you. What is something that gets your heart rate going, where that stress curve, you get really activated by the thought of that? I want you to visualize and I want you to imagine that situation. Try to put yourself in there. There's some certain people at Nebraska that might do that for me as I'm walking down the hall. I'm like, okay, right? So think about, what are those? Is it a public speaking event? Is it your children having a meltdown before bedtime? Is it some work-related stuff? What is it for you? Is it a sporting situation? Is it a coach? Is it a teammate? What is it? Parent? Okay, hopefully everybody's got something. All right. Let's see if this is going to work. Oh. I had problems with this before. Darn it. I like to do these poll everywheres. It was working on my computer. Start the presentation to see live content. Or screen share. It was coming up on mine. Did it show up on yours when you did it? The text the thing? Okay. Well, this is usually really fun, and all of your stressful things would pop up on here, but it's not showing my code for you guys to text me, so we're not going to do that. But you have your stressful situation, yes? Okay, great. All right, what I want you to do is I want you to sit with it. I want you to close your eyes. And I want you to imagine yourself as vividly as possible in that situation. As vividly as possible. So think about the proximity of yourself to things in your environment. Try to smell things. Kinesthetically notice what's happening in your body. All of that. Try to make it as vivid as possible, being in that situation as if it were happening right now. All right, I want you to put your hand back on your pulse and go, start counting. And stop. Okay, and multiply by 4 and write it down. Okay, probably went up a little bit. All right, now I want you to think about, and you can write these down if you want, because I think that's a great way to be honest with ourselves, not letting things sit in our head and forcing ourselves to either say them out loud or write them down, because sometimes it's when we do that with our brain, it makes us realize it more. What's the story in your head? What's the internal dialogue about that situation? What are those thoughts that you have about yourself and that thing that pop into your head in that moment? Oh, blank, right? I'm gonna this. They're gonna think this. Fill in the blanks. What's the story in your head? What are the automatic thoughts? Write them down if you can. And I want you to really focus on one of those that kind of comes up repeatedly. What is one of those thoughts that just really comes up over and over for you? And maybe it's something that thematically comes up in your life a lot. I find that happens, is that they tend to be those thoughts tend to be the most intense in the most intense situations. But if we really looked at our internal dialogue, we're saying those things quite frequently throughout our days. I want you to sit with that kind of core thought. And I want you to try to feel that in your body. And I want you to put your hand on your pulse again. And start. And multiply by 4. I really like making you guys put your thoughts up here, but I did this with NCAA referees. That was actually really entertaining. Their thoughts were lots of bad words. I really enjoy bad words now as a psychologist. Okay, last piece. Sensations. So our sensations, I tell people emotions are just sensations that we label. Sensations are all the things that happen in our body when we have an experience and our brain's trying to interpret it. And sometimes our body temperature rises and we get kind of sweaty, right? Sometimes our heart rate goes up, sometimes our respiration goes up, our pupils can dilate, sometimes we kind of feel tingly all over, sometimes our legs get kind of weak, right? Sometimes we get a little lightheaded. Those are just sensations in the body that your brain is using to interpret the environment. But these sensations can really intensify our autonomic activation, especially when we don't know when we're unaware of it. So I spend a lot of time with my athletes helping them increase their awareness of where they carry tension in their body and specifically where are their target tension points. A lot of them, it's jaw, back of the neck, front of the head, and they're like traps. And I will actively work on kind of becoming more aware of their stress triggers so that they can catch their body as their nervous system is increasing in its intensity. And then they can work on actively just trying to relax that part of the body, which can bring them down that curve and help them neuromodulate. So go back to your image, your situation, and those negative potential thoughts that you're having, right? And I want you to scan your body really quickly. And I want you to notice as you visualize and as you try to get as vivid of that situation as possible, what do you notice in your body? Do you notice your heart rate going up a little bit? Do you notice your core temperature increasing? Do your palms get sweaty? Do you feel tighter? Are you pulling your shoulders up? Are you furrowing your brow? What's happening in your body? Does your digestion start to slow down and do you feel nauseous? That's one of the parts of it. Maybe you need to go to the bathroom sometimes. That happens too. I want you to focus on those sensations, and if there's one sensation that's really intense for you, I want you to try to sit with that sensation for a second and just try to really focus intensely on that sensation along with that core thought. And hand back on the pulse and start counting. And stop. This is the interaction of your brain talking to your body. Hopefully you saw that change in heart rate. As we increase our activation and as we fixate on the negative aspects of activation, we actually can intensify our body's reaction to that environment and that situation. And so that's a lot of times what will happen for athletes is they'll get into a crappy situation and then they'll be like, oh my gosh, my heart rate's going up. Oh, I'm so sweaty. And they start focusing on those things. And then their activation continues to increase instead of doing something, engaging in a skill, reframing the situation, reducing the perception of risk, modulating their nervous system, calming themselves down. Those are all the things that they can do to control it, but a lot of times we just fixate, and that just intensifies our reaction. So I'm going to teach you breathing the exact way that I teach all of our athletes breathing. We talk about diaphragmatic breathing. There's different types of breathing that can be helpful. I think diaphragmatic breathing is a really easy, simple technique, and it's easy to remember. What I want you to do is I want you to put one hand on your chest and one hand on your belly and sit straight up. I tell people to imagine that you've got a string from the top of your head to the ceiling, kind of like holding you up so you can really extend your whole diaphragm. Your diaphragm is kind of down here. A lot of people don't realize your lungs go from here to here. And most of the time we're breathing up here. We're chest breathing most of our day, which actually increases our autonomic reactions. And so what we're going to work on is trying to use our whole lung capacity and breathe down deep into our diaphragm. So what I want you to do is I want you to first just take a deep breath the way you normally would. However it's comfortable for you. When I say take a deep breath, what does that look like for you? Take it. A lot of you will probably notice that your top hand raises up first. What I want you to do is you're going to focus on trying to force your bottom hand out first with your breath, and then followed by your top hand. So think of like filling a glass with water. If you were pouring a pitcher of water into a glass, it's going to fill from the bottom up. I want you to imagine doing that with your breath, and we're going to breathe in through our nose, down deep into our belly, all the way up to our collarbone, okay? And then when you breathe out, I want you to breathe out your mouth, and this is important. You're going to breathe all of that air completely out until it feels like your belly button's going to touch your back. Try breathing all that air completely out of your lungs. Okay? Now do another one with me talking less. Belly to back, all the way out. The out breath is the most important part. If you are comfortable and you feel like you're getting it, put your hands down. But I want you to keep breathing with the belly, deep down into the belly. And now I want you to focus on your breath. I want you to notice the breath as it comes in through the nose, as it moves deep down into the belly. Feel your belly forced out. Feel your chest rise. And then follow that same breath all the way back out. And just do several of those. But I want you to pay really close attention to the sensations of the breath. Noticing maybe there's slightly cooler air coming in through the tip of your nose. Maybe you notice the tickle on the back of your throat as the air comes in. You notice the rise of your belly and your chest. And then as you breathe that same air out, you notice the fall of your belly and your chest, the tickle on the back of your throat, and then slightly warmer air coming out through your nose. And I'm going to stop talking, and I want you to keep breathing, and I want you to try to keep your attention just on those sensations of the breath, and making sure that you get those full, long exhales each and every time. Complete and full exhales. And I want you to put your hand back on your pulse and start counting. And stop. And quadruple it and write it down. You just engaged in neuromodulation. Congratulations, if it was your first time. The breath is the easiest way to hack the mind and the body and to ground yourself back in the present, which makes your brain feel less fearful It's a great way to control your attention. It's a really, really simple technique. In order for that technique to be effective, though, you have to be sleeping well, you have to be fueling well, you need a healthy nervous system and a healthy brain. And then those techniques can help you kind of tackle those tough situations and be more resilient and more mentally tough. The heart and the lungs are what we just controlled, right? When we can control our respiration, we slow our heart rate down immediately, and our heart is actually talking to our brain as much as our brain is talking down to our body. There is a bundle of nerves that are actually made out of this same tissue that our brain is made out of, and that bundle of nerves, we call it the heart brain, is actually talking up to your brain as much as your brain is talking down to your body. So when you can slow your heart rate down, it actually tells your brain really quickly, like, we're not in danger, we're good, we got this, chill out. So your heart and your lungs are the simplest way to start to control your brain. All right. Great teachers always have takeaways, right? Mental toughness, sports psychology is really well-being plus mental skills in the sport environment plus ability, right? And that's what helps us have high performance cognition. It's what makes the brain a high performance organ, right? Some of us are better at that than others. Some people have to work harder at it than others. Everyone can get better at it, though, by working on skills, by implementing training in their daily life. But you do have to work on it. And working on it once isn't going to change anything. You have to do it in a regular and consistent way. You have to set goals. You have to create clear expectations. You need to write things down if you want to change them. And you need to tell people and hold yourself accountable. Sleep is the number one thing that will help you have a healthier brain that works better in high performance situations. Routines is a great way to regulate the brain. It helps the brain feel like everything is predictable. When the brain thinks things are predictable, the brain feels safer and we have more control over the nervous system. Breath control is the simplest way to hack the brain when it's gone haywire. And mindfulness training is a really easy way to start to train our brain to be able to focus on the things that we want it to focus on and to stay calm when we want it to stay calm. That's all I've got for you. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We have time for a few questions. So that I don't forget, after questions, when we release you, we will have a QR code. I don't want to show it yet because I really want you to pay attention. Key thing, huh?
Yeah.
We know you can't multitask.
No.
And I also I have a brief spiel I need to talk about Beacon, but I'd like to take the questions first, but please stay in your seats. We'll just be a few more minutes. Go ahead. Questions?
So when it comes to the human function curve,
Yeah.
with ideal performance, and like it's very individualized.
It is.
So like, how would you like find that, like where that level?
How do you assess that? So one thing I'll have my athletes do is, he asks how we assess where your optimal zone is on that curve. What I have them do a lot is think back to their most ideal performance. I'll do a visualization exercise with their most ideal performance, and then I'll have them rate from the most energized and excited they've ever been to the least on a scale of 1 to 10. Where are you in that most ideal when you were in that most ideal performance setting? And it probably varies a little bit by activity. Are you an athlete? What sport?
Throws.
Okay, throws. So you do something for a very discrete amount of time. So probably higher activation for you than if a football player needs to play for 3 hours. They have a finite amount of energy that they have to then extend over a long period of time, which is a little different than throws or powerlifting or something like that. So kind of thinking back to an ideal performance, like a time when you really felt like I was operating on all cylinders, and then doing that 1 to 10 curve, and then trying to figure out how do I distinguish, like let's say you were at a 6, right, on your energy curve, then what are some words and what are those sensations in the body that I associate with a 6? And then in practice, trying to get yourself kind of into that zone with different techniques like music, or breathing if you need to come down, right? Trying to stress yourself out in practice if maybe that's harder in competition, and then working on coming down so that you can try to find and solidify where that 6 is for you. And it's kind of a trial and error thing to a certain degree, but that can be a helpful way of doing it. Other questions? Yeah.
So this is all about physiological changes in the body from the mind. And so let's talk about coaches a little bit.
Okay.
So, as a coach, you want your individual athletes team to perform at a very high level. So you talk a lot about routine and get them into a routine of the team. And oftentimes we see coaches, at least from my experience as a coach, I didn't want to be a part of the problem that was creating anxiety, stress. And so you do things like, in terms of routine, get on the bus on time, you're getting there early so they're relaxed, and you're doing everything you possibly can, but yet there are still coaches that overcoach, that put pressure on kids, undue pressure. One that I see a lot is joystick coaching, where they're constantly yelling and screaming when all the practice and preparation has been done for that moment, but yet they continue to add to the issue. So what do you do with coaches? Do you sit there, like, you're doing this with the coaches?
At Nebraska, we do a ton of this with our coaches.
And that opens their eyes, I'm sure.
I mean, the reality is, and I didn't include this in the presentation, but human beings, our nervous system, the important part of it that causes all that dysregulation, is actually uniquely primed to respond to other people's physiology. And so we call it co-regulation. And I teach them about co-regulation, is that their nervous system and how their nervous system is being affected actually alters the nervous system of the human being across from them. We use it in psychology all the time to affect people in psychotherapy, right? Very deliberately. Coaches are using it too. The problem is that we tend to have that perception that curve, instead of looking like this, a lot of times coaches believe it looks like this. The more activated, and this, I would say that's a fairly antiquated view, probably from 30 years ago, but the more activated, you think about the football players smacking each other, right, in the locker room. The more activated I get, the better I'm gonna play. And I think that sometimes that old antiquated belief system kind of filtrates into coaching, or we think that they should just be able to function outside of me. And for some athletes, they honestly are more naturally prone towards control, and they can kind of operate within that, but other athletes are biologically wired. And frankly, we see way more trauma now than I did 10 years ago. And if you have an athlete with a trauma history, they are especially primed because their brain has been built to look for that interpersonal danger. And so they're especially primed to co-regulate with their coach. So we talk to our coaches a lot about the importance of their own composure in helping their athletes. It's easier said than done. We also empathize with the situation they're in. We don't treat them any different than our athletes. It's hard being a coach. I came from a coaching family with a very dysregulated coach. We have lots of conversations about that now. So I think that it's just education and trying to support them, and they want to be great, right? You want your athletes to perform better. So here are tools that might help you accomplish that. Now, are there very deliberate times where jumping up an athlete's butt is going to be useful because they need to activate up? Yeah, there are. Can we do that in very deliberate ways to neuromodulate in the direction of the goals, is kind of how we think about it.
Yeah, I would refer to that as differentiating the warm-up, the training, the whatever it might be, specific to the individual, because I have seen that a lot too, where they'll warm up together and they always have this very structured routine of doing it, but yet in all reality, if you let them be their own person, making up their mind on how they want to warm up, I would assume it would be more conducive to them.
I think it depends. I think in wrestling, yes. I think that in team sports, it's actually a blend of both is important. Because you do have to kind of get into this place of cohesion with the energy. So, but most of our coaches allow for their athletes to have individual time, and there's an individual prep. And Coach Rule, our new coach, he's so into all of this. But he's very intentional about, and they had me come to their whole spring day. I started in the hotel with them and just observed everything, and he's very deliberate about, these are times we're going to do these things as a routine as a team, and then this is the time you do your individual thing. And he's very deliberate about that because he understands each of them is different and unique, and they need to have their own, but he's also very intentional about, you need to have an intentional process. It's your own process, but it should be deliberate.
And although the brain regulates everything down below, wouldn't you say that that's reversed as well with
It's
training?
bidirectional.
The mind trains the body trains the mind.
It is bidirectional, yes. So so top down is the thinking and the building routines, right? And the bottom up is more that composure piece.
Do you do much with lactic acid training at all?
Not really. Mm-mm. We have sports scientists who do all of that. Yeah, I stay in my wheelhouse, and that's one of the fortunate things about Nebraska. It's like we all get to be like experts of a very finite number of things. But yeah. Other questions?
How about athletes that struggle with perfection?
Yeah. We have a lot of those. What's your question about that?
Well, what are some techniques that you might use?
I think with perfectionists, it's a lot of thought management stuff. I think that actually forcing them into failure and doing exposure training around failure is really, really important. Vulnerability and risk. Perfectionists hate risk because they always are calculating, how do I succeed? And I only want to do the things that I'll succeed at. So they have a very low threshold or tolerance for risk. So forcing perfectionists to do, and you have to help them understand why, but forcing them to expose their body to failure and have their brain learn that they're not going to die and that it was uncomfortable and I didn't love it, but I'm still alive, will help kind of reduce some of the intensity of that fear avoidance or that failure avoidance. But then I think a lot of thought management around just accepting the reality of imperfection and allowing others to experience our imperfection and realizing that we'll still be loved and accepted. Yeah.
You talked about like finding a focal point.
Yeah.
And so, like, what does that mean, or what should you be thinking about when trying to find?
So that's unique and individual to each person a little bit. With focal points, it's more about like, again, reviewing your best performances and kind of thinking about when I review my best performances, this is where my mind is at. This is where my energy is at. And then how would I create the conditions that's where my mind and my energy will be at in the future? So for focal points, it can vary by person. It again depends, do you need to kind of go up or do you need to come down? I think that it also is like, is it because my mind starts racing and I kind of get all over and I just need to focus on, for some people it might change. We use a little technique called the WIN method, which is what's important now. So like a controllable thing in my situation at this very moment that I know if I just focus on that, that's going to get me somewhere better, right? As opposed to trying to control a bunch of things that in this very moment I actually cannot control. And that our brain naturally drifts to all those uncontrollables and trying to do things that don't really make a difference at this very moment. So bringing the mind back to what's important now, and that might be the focal point itself, right? So it might just be, I'm trying to think about for like our defensive linemen, right? Like we're trying to focus on energy in their legs, right? And make my read and go. And it's that simple, what's important now. And you're just quieting the mind down to that really simple cue, maybe a cue word, maybe it's your breath, maybe it's a sense of energy and strength in your legs. So the focal points can be different, but it's just narrowing the mind to one really targeted thing to simplify the situation.
Do you work with any athletes that have like yips?
Oh yeah. I'm gonna have some traumas. She asked if I work with athletes that have the yips. So the yips is perplexing, but it's essentially, it kind of depends. There's different types of yips. There can be a yips that is essentially a disruption in the motor pathway, and it can be the result of really like exacerbated stress, or it can be the result of like a little T trauma. So big T trauma would be what we would typically think of as like, I was in a car accident or I watched someone die. Little T trauma is just things that our brain have sort of latched onto and made a bigger deal out of than they are. And our brain is kind of constantly operating with that in mind, whether we're aware of it or not. So an athlete who has a really poor performance in the context and maybe has a really high stress situation will sometimes get the yips I think of volleyball because I was a volleyball athlete, but setters will get it sometimes where we double contact. And usually it's on one particular set or in a very specific situation. And we kind of don't know why it happens, but there's essentially just like a lapse in the motor feedback process, the brain talking to the body, and outside of conscious awareness. What we do is a lot of like relaxation training to try to just stay really, really calm, and exposure training to put them in those situations. If it's true, so for golfers will get the yips and they can't hit the ball. So they'll kind of get up there and they'll just repeatedly do this and they can't hit the ball. That actually seems to be truly like the motor feedback, the neural pathway is fried. And you have to actually carve out a new neural pathway. So you have to change the way that they actually execute that skill to build a new pathway from the brain to the body that's different. So there's some different types of yips, and I would say that there's a lot of trial and error from a sports psych standpoint, but we do have effective methods. I've taken athletes and put them like, I do like biofeedback with them, and I can do a virtual biofeedback with like a tablet, and I'll hook them up and look at their heart rate variability while they're doing it and just try to like see if we can identify anything in the environment that seems to be triggering it. Like if I can watch their heart rate variability kind of jump around and it'll get into a more stressed state at certain times, we can kind of target maybe what's causing it, and then we do exposure and relaxation training. Other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
What was the name of that construct that you talked about being in the right place at the right time?
Being in the right
When like you were in the right place when things kind of just happened for you. There was
the zone or or flow states?
when in your career.
Oh, planned happenstance.
Okay, planned happenstance. Anyone here think that maybe there's a little bit more going on for Dr. Haskell than planned happenstance? What do you think?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I do have a couple of housekeeping things I want to take care of. One is there is a free app called Smiling Mind that does a lot of the same things that are being discussed if you don't have access to the funds or whatever. And we've done lots of research in our department with Smiling Mind and even with like emergency responders in the community. Please complete the QR code. This helps us with funding. It helps us to give Dr. Haskell some feedback about what you appreciated, what you liked about the speaking engagement. If you're doing course credit for Dr. Moen, do a selfie. It does not have to be with Dr. Haskell. If you're doing course credit for Drs. Hill or Forrest, please sign in before you leave because they will not listen. They will not accept my word for it. So talk about trust. They would not trust that. You need to be responsible and sign in if that was their instruction. And I do want to thank Dr. Bauer and Bill Murphy for being here and supporting this event, as well as Coach Squires and a lot of the volleyball players and the coaches who encouraged you to be here tonight. Thank you for being here. Please spread the word. At some point, this video will be available and we'll make it accessible to others. Anybody think it might be helpful to either your coaches or teammates? Yeah, please let me know. We'll make sure that happens.
Okay.
Anything else any questions or any needs from Dr. Haskell?
Thanks for coming. I appreciate it.
We still have food and snacks. Help yourself. Be reasonable. I would like it to be all eaten. So help yourself. If you have not signed in the registration, please